a start. So hopefully you're all not too tired from your second week, and you're in the unfortunate Wednesday. I get the unfortunate Wednesday afternoon with you, but everyone's stopped really far back. I don't know why. So thank you for being one of the only one in the first 3 rows. But just a reminder, please register your attendance. If you're not doing that, I get lots of attention. But also, just to advertise the Fred Piper Annual Information Security Lecture that's going to be delivered on 12th November after this lecture in the Schilling building just down the road. And Fred Piper, if you don't know, was the founder of the Information Security Group, and he has an extensive accolade within the community, and a lot of alumni come to this event. So if you do want to network and look at how people may be looking to employ people, they tend to come to this type of event. This will be delivered by Sean John, who is speaking in a personal capacity, but in a company life. She works for NCC Group, one of the UK's largest cybersecurity companies. And she'll be talking about AI in practice in general. It's a good event. There's a drinks reception afterwards. I encourage you to go, but please do sign up. You'll be able to find very easily that information online to do so. Okay, so moving to today's lecture. What we're going to look at is broadly how do we systematize information security management into an information security management system. And one of the primary ways that we do this is through standards and frameworks. And they all, in some way, tell us that we have to create a security policy of some kind. In many senses, the most mundane and boring documentation that an organization produces, but it's essential to making cybersecurity and information security effective. This is because it helps situate how we use security controls, so how much we're able to spend, what the aims and objectives of our policy are, shape the types of controls that we put into place. And I'll be going through different sets of security controls, albeit briefly, because there are so many of them, to give you a flavour of how we might try and manage security controls in context. And then I'll reflect a bit more about systematization and why we systematize in information security management, to really think about, well, what are the trade-offs that we have to think about when we're putting together a system? And what are the benefits? For example, repeatability, measurability, and so on. So today's learning objectives is to evaluate the purpose of systematization, and to look at a range of standards and frameworks with which we can do that, and to investigate how we put certain information security controls into organizations. This is primarily for enterprise systems in organizations. Standards and frameworks tend to be created for private business, so there is a bias within standards and frameworks that I'll talk about a bit more. And this is the map to our module objectives, so we're going to do some critical analysis and some comparison of different approaches. Okay. So why do we even bother with doing standards and frameworks? Why can't we just go out and design a system and say, great, we are done, we can create our own bespoke way of doing things? As if you're doing 5502, I'm sure Keith has already said not to roll your own crypto in some way. And the same principle applies for security management as well. So we need to ensure that we are developing common processes that can be audited, for instance, or comparable to other best practice. And so this forms a broader part of how organizations manage risk. And to manage risk, we typically understand that by comparing ourselves to other real-life incidents or other capabilities that we see. And so we're not just applying these standards or frameworks without any view to the context in which they're being placed. This is because, simply, there is no two organisations that are the same or operate in a similar manner. So as much as we may have industry best practice, even sectoral guidance, we still need to adapt how we apply policy and security controls in context. And some of these, we use certifications. So you may have seen certain organisations claim that they're 27001 accredited or have a certification. And this also applies in the case of UK Cyber Essentials, which is a UK framework that I'll briefly talk about later on in the lecture. But certification enables us to say, yes, I've been audited, I've been compared to others, and I have met a certain level of security practice. It does not tell us whether your security is good, right? So you can have really bad security that is certified, but it tells us something about what practices are you doing, and that gives us some semblance of whether they're enacting a good system for security management. And so this is what makes a difference between the general thinking around information security management we talked about last week, which is what are some of the principles, how might they work, and how we put those into a system that we can then use in different enterprise environments. And so there are three frameworks that I'll talk about today. This is the first one, the biggest and the most important that we use on this course, which is the ISO IEC 27000 series. And the reason why we focus on this is not because it's necessarily the best, but the reason we do is that it's the most comprehensive in terms of its consultation internationally. Most other standards have a particular geographical bias or a particular funder, such as the government, that shapes how they're done. So we're not claiming it's the best, but we would say it covers all the major content that we think is important. And then we have in this cybersecurity framework, which is created by the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the United States. And theirs is a really popular one due to many reasons that I will talk about later. And finally, because we're in the UK, looking at Cyber Essentials. This is predominantly UK-based, but there are some organisations outside the UK who have adopted certain principles or methods from Cyber Essentials. Okay, so what is the 27,000 series of standards? Well, it's anything that broadly relates to information security. But also it's broader than that. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, creates a huge variety of different standards. So it's not just a cybersecurity framework, it's actually a framework for multiple different systems and ways of doing things. They seek to standardize and systematize a range of processes. So for example, the risk management framework and standard in ISO, really for cybersecurity, derives extensively from general risk management practice for organizations. So when you're reading standards from ISO 27000, it's important to us to know where they're linking to, because they're rarely standalone in how they work, and that's what makes them very comprehensive in many senses. For us, the key standard is 27001 2022. And this is because this is what we can get certified against. So if organisations are asking for a certification, the kind of gold standard that most will say is this particular one. If you're looking for this on British Standards Online, which I hope you all have had a look at, I bet most of you haven't, it's actually now called ISO 27001 2024 plus A1. It is equivalent to this. This is how everyone talks about it. The name on the standard has changed due to some rather arcane background procedures, but it is the same thing, so don't feel that they're different. And 27002 is where security controls are placed. So as much as we might talk about systematization in 27001, 27002 provides some of the tools by which we attain certification. So, 27002 is really what I'm going to go into some more depth on today, because 27001 is more extensively covered by Sabrina Feng's lecture in Unit 4. But what ISO 27002 does is provide this list of 93 information security controls. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 93, but I will do a subset. And it structures these across 4 principal categories. First is organizational, second people, third physical, and fourth technological. In the exam, I will primarily talk about control categories. These are the control categories that I will be referring to. And it's because I don't expect you in this module to memorize all 93 controls, or even any of those particular controls. But I will be typically asking you particular control categories or an example from each one. So just so that you're aware that that's how I typically approach talking about standards, mainly because I can't remember it, so I don't expect you to remember it either. This is why we have reference material. So there's a long history to 27002. It's first published in 2005, that in turn was published in 1993. And in many senses, British standards have been the leading front of how information security is done. So if we look at not just ISO, but also much of the data privacy legislation that we see in the EU, it builds on or derives directly from British practice. And so there's a long history about how we're thinking about this compared to the other standards and frameworks. And so there was a direct transposition from the British standard in 95 through to the ISO standard internationally in 2000. And the update that occurred in 2022 replaced a 2013 version that had 14 control categories. It was widely derided as a really not good standard. The reason being is that it became too academic. There were too many people like me in the room, and we like to separate things up more and more. So what 2022 did is really bring in industry and say, what do you need simply? So it simplified down the controls that were there, and so, many of them were removed and revised, and you can see the mappings of these in Annex B within 27002 2022. So within 27002, each control has a description of what that control is, the attributes of that control, implementation guidance. So this is what we can see on this particular graphic. It's a bit small from on the back. But you can see you've got a control type. I will go more into these. So you've got a preventative control there, that you've got different security properties, confidentiality, integrity, availability, concepts such as identity, and so on and so forth. Every single control within that standard does this. These do not have to be set by the standard. Organizations can create their own. The whole point of this is that you're able to map your organization's aims and objectives, the type of attributes that you want to prioritize in a range of different controls. So that control type can have preventative, detective, and corrective formations. So preventative is clearly something that stops or at least limits the capacity of a threat to be materialized, for a violation to be exploited. Detective is identifying a breach of or a violation of that control. And corrective is how does a control potentially help you recover from a particular information security incident. And then CIA for this, but there are lots more that you can add, so I won't linger on that too much. And then you've got these cybersecurity concepts from 27011-10, which are identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. For those of you who know about standards, these look, it's a viciously similar to the NIST cybersecurity framework, albeit that the NIST cybersecurity framework has govern at the start. But this is because there are visiting delegations between NIST and ISO, so they speak quite frequently. So as much as I might say that they're different, actually they're kind of a bit more mushy than that. Actually, people move across, there's lots of conversations because we're all aiming in standards to have, hopefully, similar types of outputs. And then operational capabilities is just multiple because it depends what you're trying to operationalize. So in this example here, we've got governance. So you might have a governance function in an enterprise, and then you say, well, that's the thing that we're trying to solve. So policies is around governance, and so that's something that is self-decided by an organization. And then we've got different security domains. Honestly, you can write anything in this box if you so wish to with the hashtags, because some people might want to say, well, we want to focus on controls around resilience. So it means that when you're systematizing your system, you can say, okay, what's helping us with resilience? Bring up all those on a system and say, this is how we're thinking about resilience. What's missing? So it helps us do review and learning lessons when we're responding to incidents or recovering from them. So that's my quick blast through the kind of background, 27001, 27002. Any questions about what I just covered there? Silence beckons. So let's move on to NIST. So for NIST and this module, there are two main components that we look at, which is clearly the cybersecurity framework that most people know about, but also Special Publication 853, which is where all the controls are listed that can be used by organizations. And the NIST website has just an insane amount of documentation on it. So if you're looking for sectoral guidance, for instance, they typically have sectoral guidance for critical infrastructure, for retail, etc., and so on. So they're building up these resources that help systematize sectoral specific guidance. And this includes profiles, different risk management, lots of mappings between different sectors, and so on. But I'm not going to cover that in this module because I could do an entire module on NIST, and we unfortunately don't have time for that. But crucially for the cybersecurity framework, at least in its first iteration, this was designed for the US federal government and CNI, critical national infrastructure. So the early formations of this framework were very highly targeted to large organizations. They weren't really thinking about the small to medium enterprises that the vast majority of people work in across many different economies. So the updated framework was published in February 24. And even though this first version in 2014 was issued by executive order, as you can see on the screen, really this was such a significant change for the cybersecurity framework, because in that intervening 10 years, it became really clear that cybersecurity had fundamentally changed. In 2014, really we were still talking about large organizations. There was relatively infrequent incidents in organizations. The way that organizations operated typically more had a firewall kind of boundary system. If we think about contemporary IT today, that's clearly not the case. And so movement to 2.0 was a recognition that actually the US and others needed a broader framework to really consider the growing range of threats. And so this wasn't just a static thing. In 2018, there was a 1.1 that added, surprisingly, authentication and identity that really wasn't there before, sort of self-assessments and things around supply chains. And if we look at 2018, just before that, we'd had the WannaCry and NotPetya incidents in 2017. So you can see that this was really responding to some of the contemporary developments in cybersecurity. So the way that it describes itself now is it's designed to help organizations of all sizes and sectors across a range of places. So unlike before, which was very US-centric, there's been an attempt, albeit partially, to expand this, but it's still in many senses very US-centric, and therefore has particular understandings about what happens in organizations and compliance in particular with different legal requirements. But the biggest change is the move to a focus on governance and supply chains. So before Framework 2.0, there was no central focus on governance. And this is clearly beneficial for me as a lecturer teacher security management, but it was a recognition that you can't do effective cybersecurity in organizations without proper governance processes. And that's why it was added. And the supply chains one is clearly even more important today. If we look at the major ransomware attacks that we're seeing across the world at the moment, primarily they're coming through supply chains. It's typically a compromise of a third-party actor that is then propagating through a network because we're not doing effective checks or for multiple other reasons. And so really the governance of supply chains phenomenon is not just something from 2018, but it's something that we're seeing more and more about. So these are the updated different foci. Govern, identity, protect, respond, recover. If you remember what I just said around ISO 27110, they look very, very, very similar, and it's because they are. So in many senses, NIST and ISO 27001 have aligned in many senses. And it's because what we're trying to do is really focus on this cyber resilience. So unlike previously with cybersecurity, which tried to segment or prevent attacks, what we're saying is that every organization will face a cyber incident at some point, perhaps multiple, perhaps every single day. So it's not about us stopping incidents, albeit we should limit how many there are. Actually, it's about how do we recover from them. And that is the message from government to government to government across the world, and would probably be one of the most unifying factors of contemporary security management. And it somewhat gets propagated across different standards. So here we've got the incident management standard that we'll be talking about in Unit 6. But here they use plan, prepare, detect and report, assess and decide, respond, learn lessons, and so on. So frustratingly, all of these standards get updated at different year points. So you have to do some stitching between them to see where the concepts lie. So this is a 3-part standard, for instance, that gets released in different iterations, and we're still waiting for potential part 5 to this standard. And it makes it sometimes look different, but I would say they're all doing the same thing. They're just at different iterations and maybe using slightly different language to arrive at that. And the reason being is because the structures by which ISO and NIST as well use are typically quite fragmented. So people might be between these different committees, but they're not always in the same ones. And so 853 is, as I said, where the security controls are. And it's a direct comparator to 27002. But there are a load of controls in 853. So there were 1,189 or 589. And no organization is going through that control list. This is where NIST, I don't think, is as effective. So I really love their cybersecurity framework. I think it's freely available, for instance. A lot of organizations use it. But the control list is a nightmare. It's basically just ballooned with committee. And so this, compared to the 93 controls in ISO 27002, means that organizations typically find it easier to deal with 27002's suite of controls compared to NIST's in this particular document. And there are a couple of documents for guidance about how you might implement that. These are absolutely huge. I don't think anyone has read them apart from people who created documents through to the very end, because they are massive. But they're worth having a look at to get a sense of how NIST thinks about implementation of these range of security controls. So it's great. They've got all these different controls, loads of flexibility, and there's lots of examples online. That's very different to the ISO suite, which is very constrained into a standard. So as I mentioned, that website's got so much there. And it's freely available. ISO is not. ISO is a very, very expensive standard, and this is why most organizations do not use it. Because they think, well, they've got this free thing over here, which is great. And it means that essentially the NIST cybersecurity framework and the associated documents from NIST have made it the go-to framework for thinking about information security. All really good. But this is where it becomes a problem. When you try and do everything like NIST tries to do and expanding out, essentially most organizations switch off. Most organizations have a tiny security team, if they even have a security team at all. And so you're not going to expect your IT practitioners to spend weeks designing this. And so this is the trade-off. NIST is really flexible, but requires a significant time commitment. ISO is short, but it's really expensive. And so that often comes into a calculation about where you might focus your systematization to create your information security management system. Any questions about NIST? Okay, so moving on to Cyber Essentials. This was created in 2014, ironically the same year that NIST's cybersecurity framework was commissioned, with backing from industry. And the reason for this is that it was so clear that the UK was not responding well to a range of incidents, and organisations were not responding at all, in many senses, to the risks that they were facing. And this is because we saw a change in how UK cyber strategy was thought about. Cyber strategy before this relied on market principles, and the market, i.e. private organisations typically, self-governing or self-organising themselves to limit cyber risk. The UK government in 2014 and prior to this said this is not working, so we're going to have to be more interventionist, and this is something that we now see more and more across a range of states. And it's purported, albeit I question the research from Jerzy Susan et al. In 2015, that it can protect over 90%. They claim 99%. I'm not sure about this study. I've been told it's correct, but I looked at it and I still can't find the scientific variables by which they do this. But they claim that it prevents a significant number of internet-facing vulnerabilities across 5 different areas that I'll go into. And it was also not just about the UK not responding to cyber risk effectively, but small businesses also couldn't use ISO. It's too expensive. They don't have time to use NIST. So we need a basic baseline by which all organisations should be able to achieve a certain level of cyber hygiene, as Cyber Essentials calls it. And there are 2 options. You've got a self-assessment framework in Cyber Essentials, and then you've got a technical verification that's done by a private enterprise based on the Cyber Essentials framework, which is Cyber Essentials Plus. Unlike ISO and NIST, Cyber Essentials is highly prescriptive. So what I mean by that is you can do a lot of self-definition in ISO and NIST. You say, I want these controls in here because I'm trying to address this business need. Whereas Cyber Essentials says, no, not having any of that, because we want to keep it simple, but to keep it simple, we're going to be really prescriptive and tightly define what you need to do. One of the ways that they do this is by having a really clearly articulated scope of the boundaries of what's included in your information security management system. So here, you've got a very clear boundary around the organization, and you've got different routers and firewalls, and then you've got people working from home, essentially, as well, connecting via the internet into the organization. It might seem simple to have a scope like this, but a lot of organizations really struggle to do this, and I'll talk a bit about why. And they struggle across 5 different controls categories in many senses. So you've got firewalls and routers, secure configuration, security updates, user access control, and malware protection. If you can do all 5 of those things within a scope, in the scope provided, then you're able to get Cyber Essentials. The issue is, most people don't even know what's in their network. So how do you know what the boundary of your network looks like? It might seem simple, but your asset inventory is actually a seriously hard problem. What do you include when someone builds or adds an extra device into your network and you haven't mapped that? That introduces a potential vulnerability. Yes, you may have routers, for instance, which are in the scope to try and mitigate some of that and additional firewalls. More commonly now, people are looking towards zero trust networks as a solution to some of these things. But zero trust networks only really work in large organizations. They are not the solution for most. So, and the reason for that is that you need a significant amount of data typically to run zero trust effectively, which doesn't really work for most places. So they're going to have to try something different. And this is where really thinking about your scope and Cyber Essentials is one of the ways that can help here. In principle, all organizations should be able to achieve this. It'd be wonderful if they could. And that scoping exercise is really complex. So let's use the example of Royal Holloway, a particular organization that is not Cyber Essentials compliant. And to be honest, I can't see it being compliant for as long as I'm probably here. It's not because there's poor cybersecurity as such, but it's the complexity of that scope question. Academic institutions have lots of random bits of tech. Think about all the scientists that are spinning up random programs and little bits that they want to do for their research. It becomes really difficult to lock down your scope in that scenario. Because essentially, Royal Holloway does not know what its IT estate is. And most organizations don't either. So what appears to be essential is not easy. The fact that Royal Holloway can't do this is a real problem. And the real problem, I've got their point and I'll talk about it now, is that most UK government contracts now require you to have Cyber Essentials. So you've got a really strong business need in that Royal Holloway probably wants to get UK government contracts. That includes being able to charge fees, that includes research income. But even then, it's still struggling. So there's something really difficult about Cyber Essentials that isn't looking that essential anymore, or at least that simple. One of the ways that organizations have tended to get around this problem is by creating subsets in their networks. Say, for example, imagine that I run a computer lab. And that computer lab needs Cyber Essentials. It's working on a defense contract, for instance. And to win a defense contract in the UK, you have to have Cyber Essentials. There's just no way around that. So what you do is you say, well, this is my network. I've scoped it off. It's wonderful. It's a subset of the broader network. We've got clear segmentation between different networks. our authentication looks different, etc., and so on. So you're able to say, great, that's fully segmented from the Royal Holloway organisation. Oh dear, this is what really made Royal Holloway sad. So a few months ago, in April, it was clarified that you really need to show that you're segmenting your networks. You can't just claim that you are, which is what a lot of organisations were doing, because they found Cyber Essentials really hard. So it's not that we shouldn't be doing this work, it's just too expensive and often too much work for the small teams that we have in security management or in an IT practice. And to be honest, I can't see how Royal Holloway is ever going to achieve this. Not because it doesn't want to, but it's actually just a really hard problem. And the reason for this is because Cyber Essentials was never created for a complex organisation like a university. We have one of the most, or academic institutions have some of the most complex IT estates in any organisation. Cyber Essentials was targeted towards small and medium enterprises, which could clearly identify their scope, or at least reasonably so. When you move to larger organisations, that becomes increasingly difficult. And so this expansion of Cyber Essentials made common sense to a lot of politicians and policymakers, but as soon as you spoke to people in the more technical communities, they just threw their hands up in the air and said they don't understand. It might be essential, but it's not easy. And so as I mentioned, to get government contracts, you need to be able to do this, or at least demonstrate it. But then again, we've got a self-assessment process. So how good is your self-assessment? I'm not saying anything about the quality of self-assessments, but you can see that there might be a lot of massaging that occurs in organisations to show that they're Cyber Essentials compliant. Okay, I've spoken a lot at you. Any questions on what I just said about Cyber Essentials? Yeah, so essentially Cyber Essentials is just your self-assessment. Cyber Essentials Plus is that you get an external auditor who comes in and tests what you've claimed on your self-assessment. So it verifies that your self-assessment is correct.
So it's the same level of standards?
Same level of standards, exactly the same, it's just about whether one's externally verified or whether it's a self-assessment. Most people fail their first self-assessment. So that tells you about how effective self-assessment may be. So if you're looking for Cyber Essentials on organisations, look for Cyber Essentials Plus would be my recommendation. Any other questions? Okay, I'm sure you're all excited for a group activity on a Wednesday afternoon. So, in your groups, consider a benefit and disadvantage for organisations for ISO, NIST, and Cyber Essentials to develop an information security management system. You don't have very long for this. You have 5 minutes, and then we'll talk a bit more about some of the benefits and trade-offs that occur for information security management systems. Let's make a start, I think. So what we're going to look at in this section of the lecture is really how do we do security controls. Primarily, I'll be using that 93 set from ISO 27002 rather than the more expansive NIST set. But the core to all of information security management systems is policy. And we have 2 types of policy that we typically refer to. So we have top-level policy, which is the general policy for the entire organisation. This tends to be very high level in terms of generic, so it might say we want to ensure confidentiality, integrity, availability, etc. It's about providing leadership. I'll go into more detail on that. And then we've got topic-specific policy. So that might be policy around home working or encryption policy. And so this is how we tend to define. So you have a top-level policy, then sitting underneath that, a series of topic-specific policies. So for any ISMS, every organisation must define what its information security policy is. Crucially, this must be approved by management and provide the organisation's approach. The reason why it's important to have management involved is because they're the ones who fund information security. So if they've agreed to say this is our approach to information security, then they've got to fund it because they've made a policy around it. So this is a really important step to ensuring that you have money to do things. It must be published and communicated to people both internally and externally. This is to show a commitment that you care about information security or cyber security. Most organisations now have something like this. And the reason we have to publicise it is because some people might say, well, I don't want to work for an organisation that's only prioritising a particular type of way of doing things. That's very rare nowadays, but historically was much more so. So an information security policy will reflect the business strategy. We can't, in an enterprise environment or other organisation environments, do information security unless we understand what the business strategy for the entire organisation is. What are we aiming for? It will also include references to regulations, legislation, and contractual obligations. So, for example, you may say, we will remain compliant with all UK law. Very generic, but it's a statement of purpose about what the organisation seeks to do. Crucially, it has to think about what the environment looks like. So what's the threat profile by which the organisation is operating in? Is it benign or is it highly volatile? Because this gives a sense to see from senior leadership about, well, how much money are they willing to invest? Because if you say, well, the current environment means that it's basically no risk to us, you're not going to get any money to invest in security. If you get a statement there saying it's highly volatile, there's a clear statement by senior management that they know it's highly volatile. And that means that they must give commensurate resources to information security. So, for example, the NHS has a relatively old information security policy from 2016. And it contains many features, right? So, as required within this particular control of information security policy. It includes definitions of information security. So that's why last week I was getting you to really think about what information security is, because it's crucial to effective policy making. What are the objectives and principles to guide activities? This is why last week I was getting you to think about what is an objective. I wasn't just doing it because I like to make you feel uncomfortable potentially in creating objectives. There was a real purpose, because for any security practitioner, you need to know what that is, because it helps you make your case, whether you're going to be in more governance and compliance or whether you're going to be in a technical role. And you want to get a commitment that they're going to continually improve, because, to be honest, if they're not willing to continually improve, you're going to be out of a job, because you need to sustain yourself in really quite pragmatic terms. And the responsibilities to who is responsible for leading the strategic direction of information security. Is there a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer? Is it the Chief Risk Officer? And the CISO sits under the Chief Risk Officer. These are really important to show how the organisation seeks to structure itself. And how do you handle deviations from your information security policy? Who makes a decision to say, we do not have to follow this? This becomes so important when you work in an organisation, because deviations occur relatively frequently. But having a named role that takes that decision means that someone can't pass that book on to you. So if, for example, you're leading an information security function, and you say, well, you've not given me money to do X, therefore Y can't occur, that has to be made by a decision maker, not you. So this is about aligning decisions in an organisation for security management to those around handling deviations and exceptions. So clearly, top-level policy is not enough. There's not enough detail in there. It's a really broad brush stroke of what policy is in the organisation. So we have these things called topic-specific policies. And you can't have information security policy at the top level without a range of topic-specific ones underneath. So it's the implementation of controls. So, for example, if you're worried about your cryptography topic-specific control, what cryptographic control mechanisms are you going to integrate into your system? What, if you've got working from home, for instance, what range of controls do you need to have around access, authentication, devices, etc.? They would sit in a topic-specific policy. Crucially, it's not about the how, because that is layered down in what we call procedure that I will move on to. And it might also be to target groups or certain topics, right? So these are highly flexible. An organisation will self-define what topic-specific policies it needs. We might, for example, use NIST's sectoral guidance to say, well, this is what the sector tends to focus on, so maybe we should adopt that as well. So there's lots and lots of guidance out there about how different sectors may wish to create topic-specific policy. So these are a range of different topic-specific policies we might have. For example, you need to know what you're going to do with backup. That's really important when you're talking about incidents. Or if we're looking at asset management, which I discussed with reference to Cyber Essentials, and the difficulties of scope, for example, at Royal Holloway. Unfortunately, in my experience, most of these are written absolutely atrociously. And it's because people don't understand the difference between topic-specific policy and procedure, primarily. Because what they do is often combine policy statements, i.e. strategic direction of an organisation or a particular topic in that organisation, with how to do it. And this is because they're primarily written by people who do it. But there's a distinction to be made between a policy that stays relatively stable and the how. Because the how might change quite frequently. You may need to introduce a new particular security product. You may need to adapt to a particular contract. We don't want to be rewriting policy every time we need to update anything in the information security management system. So essentially, policy sets the scene by which everything underneath it should be constructed. So the principles, the rules, the responsibilities that exist within that. And the procedure gives us a particular set of steps by which to achieve an element, potentially, of a topic-specific policy. It's really important that you make this distinction. And one of the things that tends to happen in policy, in topic-specific policies, is there are no named named roles for the responsibility of those topic-specific policies. This means that they never get updated. Because unless there's a named role that's responsible for that topic-specific policy, it will never get updated. And it should never be a named individual, because people change in organisations. So it should always be connected to a role. And the reason why we need a named role is because we need to make sure we're maybe reviewing these every year. Often it will to say, yes, that policy still stands, we are happy, But crucially, a decision maker has signed that. So if they've signed that, they've also taken on the accountability for if it goes wrong, because they've missed something. So it's about distribution of responsibility and accountability within an organisation too. And a particular named role can't just say, I'm going to create my little topic-specific policy and not share it with everyone. Because ultimately, cybersecurity often works across all units of an organisation. And to do that, we are often not, as IT security practitioners, the owners of most of the topic-specific policies. HR, for instance, would be the people who often are responsible for contracts. So, as IT security professionals, we are typically also engaging with a huge range of people, and they have to be accepted. We can't sit in a cupboard, to use a metaphorical term, and say we created a really, really good topic-specific policy and a set of procedures underneath. Because if they're not accepted, the organisation will simply not follow it. And that exists both at the kind of the lower rungs of the hierarchy, if we're looking at conventional business structures, through to senior leadership. So you have to get acceptance across all of that. That's one of the trickiest things of security management to do effectively, is getting buy-in. How do you get people to accept that the policy maybe needs to change and there may be different policies need to be introduced? And that's why policies have to be owned. Someone has to say, that is mine. Sometimes that causes problems when someone holds on to it too much. And there's a lot of that happens in organisations, because sometimes it might be related to their job security. So if their job's on the line, if they give that up, that's when you start facing problems. So you also need a policy for changing policy. And they can't exist alone. They've got to be interlinked across all different areas of the organisation. And this is where systematization becomes really important, because we need to know how everything fits together. Much of contemporary security management policy now has quite sophisticated tools to be able to show these links, and it's much easier than it used to be. But you still need to understand. Technology is not going to help you very much here. And we've got to see not just a kind of horizontal view of how everything fits together, but how it moves up and down as well. So is your procedure, in the long run, connecting to topic-specific policy and then top-level policy? If there's a mismatch between these different layers, that then also becomes a problem. So has anyone got any ideas about what might be some of the problems we face with compliance with information security policy? Exactly, and so here this is where you start to realise quite how damn difficult security management is. It's one of the most difficult parts of all cyber information security to do well for organisations. And the reason that banks and financial services tend to have huge security compliance teams is because their risk tolerance is really quite low, mainly because they get lots of sticks and lots of fines thrown at them. But most organisations can't do that. And so financial services tends to be the best at doing this, but only because they're absolutely forced to. It's not because they're willing, I would argue. I don't think many organisations, at least in the contemporary market that we have, are particularly willing to invest in security unless there's particular types of sticks. There are, of course, people who do want to do this well, but there's a balance to be struck. Anything else that someone can think of? You had your hand up earlier, I'm not sure whether... I'm going to make a statement that probably most people might find controversial. There is no organisation in the world that's compliant at all. Like, you choose your compliance from which bits you want to be compliant with. The world, in theory, looks nice. You have laws and regulations. I'll talk more about this in Unit 7, where things all look great and rosy. but actually it's impossible for all organizations to be compliant all the time. You always have deviation from compliance. So you're right. Every organization has to cut corners because there's simply too much to do. So as much as every single organization is going to face incidents, every single organization also is not compliant. So this is the trick of security management. We're trying to balance a lot of risks from attackers, but also internal compliance as well. This is really quite tricky. I saw a hand at the back, I can't remember which person it was, in that kind of general direction. Yeah. We can't do everything, so we just have to choose. And this is why security policy is so important, because you're not going to explicitly say you're not going to be compliant, because no one's going to write it down for obvious reasons, but you make strategic choices about where your focus is going to be, which means that you don't have focus in other places. And this is just an inevitability of the complexity of the broader environment that we're working in. That's why I would argue that we've moved from cybersecurity as a frame in most organizations to cyber resilience. Because resilience already accepts that there's failure modes everywhere. And one of these is compliance. Yeah. So that was a very quick canter through the importance of security policy. It's by far the most boring thing you'll ever have to do, probably, but it's also one of the most important. The amount of poor documentation I've seen, which then really does directly lead to incidents occurring because of a lack of systematization, is honestly probably the main reason why we don't have good cybersecurity. It's not because we don't have the technology. We typically do have the technology, we just don't know how to systematize it together very well. Okay, so now we're going into a deep dive of different security controls from 27002 across those 4 different categories: organizational, physical, technological, and people. And out of these, ISO treats organizational as a remainder category. Basically, if it doesn't belong in technology, physical, or people, put it in organization, that's where it lives. So there's some odd things that sit within that. And as I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but what I've done is kind of grouped what I think exists in these 4 different control categories. So in this case, I've got the core, something around the relations that organizations have, the procedures of organizations, their obligations to themselves or others, as well as the production of documentation. So that core is the information security policy, the roles and responsibilities, but also segregation of duties. Does anyone know why we want to segregate duties? I saw a hand. Look at. So you might have shared job duties, but why might that be a problem for security? Yeah. So if you've got a policy hierarchy and you've got someone making a decision, you want to make sure that they can't make consecutive decisions that privilege themselves potentially, so malicious insiders. But also you need to make sure that you've got clearly defined roles so that there isn't that kind of tension that sits within someone. This is particularly important when we turn to more HR processes. Your manager, for instance, shouldn't be officially responsible for your salary. That's typically done by HR. In practice, it looks very similar, but they're meant to be distinct because your manager may hate you, but HR doesn't. And that segregation of duty is really important. It means that you can still get a pay rise, for instance, and your manager hate you. That's a really important segregation of duty, which tends to get blurred in practice, but is important to the well-being of people in organizations. And in this, you have different management responsibilities, whether it's from the executive board or other types of places. So for the rest of this, I'm going to give you some examples of controls from 27002. And one of these is supplier arrangements in the types of relations that organizations pursue. And here, it's about making sure you have a topic-specific policy and then a control that really looks at supply chains. So how are you connecting all of these different things together to manage information security risk? So that might be identifying critical supplier types. What's the sensitivity of their access to your systems? Or what are they providing you? This has become so crucial. Now we're really looking at ransomware moving through supply chains at what seems ever increasing intensity. Then we've got organisational information. Here we've got classification information. So how do we say that that information should be accessible to some people and not to others? How might we attain CIA on different people's access to that, for instance? And ISO recommends that information owners are responsible for classification. I can't remember the last time in the university where I categorised any information for email, but that's what ISO says that we should do, right? But clearly that doesn't work in practice. I don't often classify a lot of information. That's often automated now in the background, which is really good for users. And it's connected to the labelling of information as well. So what labels? Are you saying sensitive, top secret, etc.? In many senses, these almost seem quite arcane parts of the information security management system because we often just share lots of information all the time. But this is where there's also key vulnerability that emerges when we're sharing a huge amount of data. So data leakage protection, for instance, is really interested in how you classify labeled information because it enables you to work out well, what should be sensitive and what shouldn't be sensitive and how you share that information in an organisation. And then we've got different obligations. These typically relate to legal and regulatory requirements. So privacy and personally identifiable information in 27002 is around privacy, right? And this was an addition in the 2022 version of the standard for obvious reasons. It came after GDPR and other international movements on privacy-led regulation. So you might include things around compliance, the need for a privacy officer, which most jurisdictions now require in some way or another. And things like consent, how do you gather that, on what occasions? And so, in many ways, privacy is quite an interesting concept. I won't linger on it too long, but it crisscrosses a lot of the information security world because organizations typically have very large sticks at the kind of enterprise level senior management, so they're really interested in privacy. And so they will typically want a really stringent policy on this, and that's something that we often have to negotiate with cost. And then we've got organizational documentation, so collection of evidence. Right, exactly, so it might be a post-incident analysis that we need to apply in the case of collecting evidence, court cases, etc. Super important for digital forensics that we do this in an appropriate way. So that record on manipulators, so ensuring that the integrity of our records typically, and that they're available, right? So in some cases, people might want to emphasize the I and the A and not so much the C here, but it depends what you're trying to do. So if your organization is completely knocked over, you're probably going to prioritize your integrity and availability because confidentiality might prevent you doing something. So it depends on the context that you're working in. We don't always seek to achieve CIA all the time. It depends on the context that the organization's working in. And this is a really tricky one for people who are working in international organizations. Every single state has slightly different requirements for legal admissibility in court cases, and this is just where you go to lawyers and say, what do you need? Because as IT practitioners, we don't typically understand the level of detail, and so this is where you have to be in conversation with others. So, as a brief whirlwind tour of the organizational control category, we've got like core, policy, management, responsibilities, and then how do organizations relate to one another? We look at supply chains, contracts would also sit in there. What types of information are organizations dealing with? So last week I talked about, well, is there value to the information? And I think that raised a few eyebrows, but this is where it is important because we're protecting certain types of data, for instance, that then have informational value to the organization, which is important. And then what obligations do they have? Legal, regulatory, but also to their staff, right? So you might say, well, we want to be held accountable. We want to have a transparent structure. We want people to be able to say when things are wrong in our organization. And then finally, got documentation. If we don't have documentation, how do we systematize? We need to be writing things. So when you're creating control, you can't just put in a technical solution and say, great, I'm done. No, you have to describe what it's doing and how it's relating to the rest of the organization. A lot of technical tools are making this so much easier, so it doesn't have to be like a classic Word document or anything like that, but we do need to have some type of documentary evidence of how organizations work. Any questions on organizational controls? So there are only 8 controls out of the 93 relating to people. From an ISO and ISMS perspective, I will argue that there should be far more, but that's for a later week. But I think we can see them across 3 different axes, which is contracting, journeys, and reporting and awareness. Clearly, organizations need to do contracts. In this case, it says you state the responsibilities for information security. So when you sign up to the university, you agree to a set of terms and conditions that you'll use IT responsibly. That's part of this. So every organisation should be doing this. It seems in many ways quite simple. Importantly, it's also often the first time that an individual that enters an organisation or interacts with an organisation encounters information security. You've got to be careful not to make that too obtuse, because it sets off a particular relationship with people. And you will have a whole range of things that will sit underneath this. So how your disciplinary report is working. So could a manager, for instance, seek to incriminate one of their employees? So how are you making sure that your systems are aligned to disciplinary processes? So can you collect evidence, for instance, to provide that? And in particular, non-disclosure agreements. These have been particularly used to obscure bad behaviour. And many organisations are now taking steps to not use them as frequently. Universities in particular have been very bad at using non-disclosure agreements to obscure poor behaviour by senior management to avoid that being publicly disclosed. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about people in Unit 5. And then we've got different journeys that people go on. The classic one is remote working, and there's been updates to Cyber Essentials in this particular area, so they now talk about remote and home working because they're now recognised as somewhat different domains, because home setups tend to be more permanent and therefore have slightly different security requirements. And for this control, you typically need a topic-specific policy with different guidelines, measures for remote working, as you would expect. And obviously, it's become a really important part of how we live today. And then people are not just things that we seek to protect in an ISMS, but they're also active participants in it. So they typically will report incidents, and we need to ensure that there's broader awareness. So here, how can you report Royal Holloway whether there's a security incident? Do you know how? Anyone know how? One? Any more? How do we do it? So what would happen if all of the IT went down? What would we do? Do you know where they are? Where's the help desk? Well, they don't know anything about IT, right? I don't know where I'm going, right? And this is part of the problem. Oh, and the first one person does, thank you. Because I honestly don't know. And this shows some of the problems, right? So there used to be a little reporting widget on the Outlook on my laptop where I could report suspicious messages. But I don't think Royal Holloway is a particularly good process for doing this, right? So I wouldn't say it particularly engages with this control. But for organisations that are particularly, for example, you might have lots of different sites, this becomes really important because if you have downtime across multiple sites, where does someone go to report a particular incident? How do they communicate is really important. And so what we have to remember, and people who are interested in doing IY 516, usable security, how do we make it usable? How do we make it easy for people to do so? The fact that one person, I feel, had a really good idea of how to do it shows it's probably not usable nor easy, because we should just know it, but we don't. That's partially an issue with universities in general, not trying to overly pick on Royal Holloway here. So people really, in terms of an ISMS and how both ISO and NIST talk about it, and less so in Cyber Essentials, is around contracting, the journeys that they might go on around an organisation and outside, and reporting and awareness. So often in information security management systems, the physical side often gets neglected. And the reason, this is why this isn't called cybersecurity management system in many senses, because information security typically refers to things at both rest and in transit, whereas there is a bias in cybersecurity as a term to focus on interconnectedness and transit. This is why this is information security management and not cybersecurity management in many senses. Right, ahead of my points. And so I think you can see physical controls across 4 axes in 27002. First, around work location, assets and equipment, infrastructure, and the broader environment. Oops. So clearly, one of the things that we might want to think about is making sure that people can't get access to places where they shouldn't be. This is important for information security because physical access to devices can lead to exploitation of vulnerability. A lot of the more niche use cases tend to do that. So you might want to restrict access to authorized personnel, maintain logs of door entries, wearing visible identification, and so on more note. And I often deliberate to myself whether the last one is actually a helpful suggestion or not. Because if we look at most phishing exercises or behavioral studies, visible identification is exactly the way that you break security. So I'd rather than say that you must prove your identity, so it's about challenging people that they've got the correct authorization to be in a particular space. Otherwise, you don a high-vis jacket and a fake ID, and you'll get in basically most places, especially when receptions are under duress, etc., and so on. And then we've got the assets and equipment, the things that really form an IT estate. So we might think about servers, we might think about different data, as it says there, and how we therefore securely dispose of that is really important. Because one of the things that we've become increasingly reliant, and fortunately I would argue, is the emergence of hyperscalers and being able to deposit a lot of our computing needs in different places that just tend to be, on the whole, more efficient in terms of computing power. But we still have a lot of assets that we hold in organizations. Yes, we're not talking about removable media as such anymore, but most people will have a phone which has some type of company or organizational data on it. So how are you removing or wiping data from devices? That's something that we do have to think about, and this really encounters problems when we see that Royal Holloway doesn't provide me a phone, but if I didn't have a phone, I wouldn't be able to really do my job effectively. And so, in many senses, the ISMS of Royal Holloway extends to my phone, but they wouldn't necessarily recognize it in that way. This is why Cyber Essentials is hard, because this is not owned by Royal Holloway, but they have a stake in ensuring the information security of it. And so, one of the things that you might want to think about is access to authorized personnel. I broke this completely, partially on purpose because I really needed some water, by leaving my computer unlocked. I'm glad that no one exploited vulnerability that was, but you could have, right? And so in this environment, I know that you've got relatively limited access from this particular computer to my personal files, but you could have, right? And so we're constantly having to think about how to break those is not secure, I suppose I'm somewhat riffing off it. So we've also got cabling security, and how do we get cables in and out? So the classic example here is high frequency trading. So if we look at financial centres in London, Frankfurt, New York, there's some very, very sensitive cabling infrastructure that has very, very low security protections on it, because the business objective of high frequency trading is to do your trading at a high frequency, and you can't be slow. So typically, the amount of security protections are super low. So what financial institutions that engage in this type of trading, if they own the cable, subcontract it out, there's additional physical security that sits around the cables because the information security and digital security elements can't be implemented. So sometimes, depending on the context, you might be relying more on your physical control than you are on your conventional information security controls like encryption. Also, things like power outages can be really significant. There's only a few cases where I can see it as a benefit, which was the AP Moller-Maersk in response to NotPetya, where their domain controller was saved, and I've spoken to one person about this before, was saved by a blackout in Ghana. Otherwise, their entire infrastructure would have been completely gone, essentially, and they would have had to rebuild from scratch. But we have to think about how are we keeping availability of our systems, and that includes things like power. And there's a few other things that I won't focus on too heavily. And then we've got the environment. So how are we protecting against different threats? So this could be classical things like your natural disasters, but also things such as protests. There might be instances which impact your information security in that sense. So we might also think about earthquakes which aren't necessarily atmospheric, and so on and so forth. And here, this is where climate change is an issue. Regardless of whether you believe what is causing climate change does occur, and that has an impact on information security. And this is why all the standards have these weird plus A4 or A1 on them, because that was when they introduced the London Declaration on Climate Change to all ISO standards. So this is now part of them, which it wasn't until 2024, last year. So we can think about physical controls through work location, assets and environment, infrastructure, and environment. Any questions about what I just said? All wanting to go home. Okay, I'll try and encourage the speed then. So we've got the technological last set of controls. These are the things that pretty much generally people understand to be core information in cyber security. And it's the thing that we typically have the strongest interest in terms that we tend to be the owners of these controls more so than the other controls. And I think we can see it across multiple different axes around access, networks, secure by default, vulnerability and prevention, and to be honest, just lots of others because it gets really hard to categorize. And so we can think about access in terms of privileged access, so how you're going to ensure that people can access only the information that they should, and those restrictions are managed in certain ways. And we'll have things such as an access control policy, which we all sign up to when we join an organisation in the contracting section of the people controls. And then we have networks. So ensuring that you've got service level agreements. So ensuring that organisations will say, we are going to give you X amount of service at a minimum, and that's what you will get. This is particularly important if you're dealing with cloud services, for instance. What's the latency? What's the uptime of your different services? And also about defining your technical parameters, such as full virtual private networks. If you want to access some services at Royal Holloway, you have to have a VPN if you're not on site and using an internal Campus Connect. Then we've got secure by default. So making sure that we're engineering systems that default to secure positions. This has been a really common theme for much of the work internationally to build in upstream a lot of security into our system. So making sure that we don't have lousy software libraries that introduce vulnerabilities. Or if we do have vulnerabilities in, for example, open source software, how do we make sure that we've got a systematic process to evaluate those updates? One of the things that happened in most of the supply chain incidents that we see is that people do not have structured ways of getting updates into their environments, into their IT estate. So what happens is that they just accept it. So basically you've just got to completely trust the other organization completely, because if you're updating systems without checking, then that's a problem. That requires a lot of work as well, and that's where you have to say which services are most important to us, which segments of our IT estate are we really interested in. And so there's a whole range of different things that I might do, but you can read that in the standard itself. And we might think things like secure oriented design reviews, ensure we've got segregation of duties. So the person who manages someone shouldn't be the person that's also approving their code, because they could be in alliance to deceive the organization. So you've got to make sure you've got segregation of duties, for example, during design review. And then we've got vulnerability and protection. So how do we ensure that the vulnerabilities that we see, that we're managing them? We might not be able to fix them straight away, so we might want to say, well, we're going to put a particular device that's out of updates in a particular segmented system, because we can't afford to update that, or there's not a replacement. This is particularly the case for medical devices and hospital environments. And we might be saying, well, we need to make sure we've got a good systems inventory, because unless you've got a good asset inventory, you don't know what vulnerabilities on what systems you have. And this is why it's so important to have a strong asset inventory. Hence why universities are particularly vulnerable and one of the most targeted type of institutions currently by cyber criminals, because they know universities have a terrible asset inventory. And it's a really easy way to get in, because there's lots of connections that are just not monitored. And we might introduce pen tests or other tools to automate some of our detection of vulnerabilities in our systems. So, technological is roughly around access, networks, secure by default, vulnerability and prevention, and a range of other types of control. I really whizzed through that so I can get you home early. Any questions? Lots of people smiling. Okay, so I'm just going to try and bring this all together, and then we can all go home, or as I'm going to the airport, I can't be late today either. So this is how I broadly split up ISO 27002. This is not published anywhere, this is just how I thought about it. But I think this gives you a really good sense of what an organisation seeks to do broadly. This is not just an information security thing, but actually using 27002 enables us to say, actually, this is really what cybersecurity and management systems really look like. So I've tried to distill it further down, because 93 controls is really difficult. So in an exam, for instance, you might want to say, well, I want to talk about environment controls. I don't expect you to quote the particular number for a standard, but I would want you to say, for example, contracting is important, but give me a more particular example, but you don't need to tell me the kind of precise rendition of that from a standard, because honestly, no one needs that in an exam. So, got a short group activity. It's about putting some of these controls to work. So here I've got an example of Alex, who is a CISO at growing small business, and there's been an incident, oh no, and some sensitive intellectual property has been stolen. And they have some designers that work out of one office. There's an on-site server, quite unusual these days, that is used, but no one knows what's happened. Oh dear, how are we going to help Alex? So what I want you to do is select one control, or a rough approximation thereof, for each control category, and say how it might help Alex to assess a similar incident in the future. So how might Alex learn some lessons and introduce some new controls to help work out and detect what's going on and potentially prevent it? Okay, so we're on the home straight. So, systematization. The reason we have to systematize is because if we don't know how all those controls interrelate with one another. Because you could have one fantastic technological control that's scuppered by an organizational control, and vice versa. And so we've got to make sure that things interrelate. And this is why we have topic-specific policy. So topic-specific policy enables us to abstract in the organization to a point of understanding interdependencies for a particular output that we want to achieve. And that's why we might have multiple procedures that help us attain a particular control set that achieves our aims and objectives in a particular topic-specific policy that then links up to the top-level policy in the organization. And the only way that we can really do this is through an information security management system, hence why this is going to be a key component of the rest of this module, albeit I will provide significant critique to this as I go through. But what it does do, it enables us to connect to best practice. So best practice in standards and frameworks and whatever is out there, there's lots of really good stuff. This is why I really like NIST. And I really like ISO, because they provide different things. It depends on the context of the organization by which you want to see what best practice is. But really, it enables us to do measurement. So it enables us to say, well, how well are we doing at X, Y, and Z? Because ultimately, when you're going to decision makers, they don't necessarily care about procedure. They care about cost and time. So how do you measure the impact of that upon your organization and the potential unrealized benefits is really quite tough, because security is often defined in the negative. We're often preventing something happening. So there's no cost if it doesn't happen, but it does if it does. So how do you justify your security expenditure? And one way that you do this is through an ISMS. And we're not often the owners of most of the risk. And so we are always working in collaboration with different people. And this makes it quite a tiring job, because you have to be conversant in speaking to lawyers, speaking to HR professionals, speaking to operational technologists, etc., and so on. As well as your marketing, your communications team during moments of incident and crisis. So we need to be fluent in basically all parts of the business. That's a tough ask on us to do that effectively. But if we do not align systematization to the business objectives, we'll get ignored, because we'll be seen as blockers in the organization. And in many ways, security does slow things down, but it's about slowing things down in a way that seems the most productive. So clearly, we need policy to do this. Despite my utter hatred of writing and documenting policy, we have to do it. There's just no way around doing this otherwise. And another reason we want this is that it limits insider knowledge. So if we do not document, then we're relying on particular individuals that become powerful in our organizations. That gives them significant leverage and capability to exploit. So having effective documentation enables repeatability of the system. And that's part of systematization that we need to achieve as well. And there are also many other things that you could probably attribute to systematization as well. But in systematization, we also lose something, that flexibility. So if we go back to last week where we talked about the objective-based approach versus the threat-based approach, and thank you to those who commented on formative reflection. Here, this is where we have challenges, because systematization tends to really privilege the objective-based approach. Yes, we can have flexibility of a threat-based approach in certain topic-specific policies, but this is really an objective-based way of doing information security. And that broader environment that we're working in is getting more complex. If we look at the time to exploit of different vulnerabilities, it's now gone into negative according to some accounts. So it means that a patch is released after it's already been exploited. That's changing how we operate as organizations. How do we deal with the fact that AI agents are going to be exploiting our systems quicker than we can respond? That poses significant problems for systematization because the environment's encouraging us to move in the opposite direction, which is to be responsive. And this is where cyber resilience has kind of come in as kind of a bridge between systematization and that dynamically changing environment, whether it's IT and OT systems, the broader threat environment, demands on organizations in terms of legal compliance that we might have, etc., and so on. So, kind of starting to provide a summary is that we all have to be policy fluent. There's unfortunately no way around it. And information security controls just don't work unless we put them together in some sort of system. So how do we do that effectively is how we'll be looking really for the rest of the module. And that's why we have to engage in systematization processes. We can't just sit alone. We have to be out there doing it because otherwise we're not doing a good job. So the unfortunate reality, I'd like to just write and do things by myself, but I can't. So just to go over today's objectives, what we've done is really evaluate the purpose of systematization. We've explored NIST, ISO, and Cyber Essentials, and we've investigated how we might use controls in different ways through primarily the group work. So remember, you can always contact me. I've got bookable meetings. And please do the formative reflection under Unit 2, that's now live. And I shall see you all next week for risk management.